Everybody down here's lied to me tonight. Kenny didn't say he was going to say a word, and they didn't tell me we were going to do TV. My goodness. I look around here, and I see lots of sons and daughters of the original people in Kingsport. John Wayne would call us all pilgrims. We're not pioneers, we're a generation removed. But many of our mothers and our fathers came here and started Kingsport. Tonight, Kenny is going to do our technology, our pictures, and I'll be doing the commentary. Tonight we're going to talk Kingsport from 1917 to 1946, because those were the years when it boomed. Now, Kenny, how about Kingsport in 1928 to 30? Broad Street. Broad Street. Here we go. That's Broad Street. About 1928. Now, see, the street's paved. There are no pigs. There were pigs. There were pigs in Kingsport till Dr. Yancey, who was the hookworm doctor, get a load of that, till he told everybody, get the pigs out of town. Cows can stay, pigs go. This is Kingsport. Kingsport looked pretty good in 28, not bad. You should have seen it in 17. Kingsport in 1917 could have been transplanted to the Wild West. It was muddy. Everybody slogged around in galoshes. It was wild. The first police chief, who was named in 1917, and I'm not going to name him, was fired because he solicited not one but two ladies of the evening. The second police chief got down on Broad Street on a Saturday night, and he got drunker than everybody else, and he got shot. He didn't die, but they fired him. The third one, who was hired by Frank Cloud, city manager, I used to hear my daddy mention him, the third police chief was Cam King. And he was told by Frank Cloud, clean this town up. You got to clean this town up. He set about to do it. Now, there were three things that caused Kingsport to go. The first was really progressive thinking, quite progressive, by three particular men. The second thing was Northern money. Now, we must not kid ourselves. In 1917, in the hills of Tennessee, there wasn't any money. We had to have Northern money to get this place going. But we did have one very important thing, which we still have today: a great workforce. These people were Scotch-Irish. They were hard drinking and hard fighting, but they were also hard working. So the workforce that was here is what got Kingsport going, along with the Northern money and along with the progressive thinking of three men. And the first one was George Carter. The second was John B. Dennis. And the third, J. Fred Johnson. I started to say, that's Pearlie Wilcox you put up there, Kenny. On the left is John B. Dennis. Okay, in the middle is Mr. Johnson, J. Fred. I remember him vaguely, and he always looked rumpled. See, he still looks rumpled in that, but he was always friendly and smiling, and he gave out candy. Children like that. Pearlie Wilcox, of course, not one of the big three we're going to talk about. I'm going to start with George Carter, okay? I got to get some water. Wait a minute. George Carter was from Carroll County, Virginia. He was a landowner. He was also a mine. He owned lands where the mines were in Kentucky and Virginia. George Carter wanted a railroad. Now, I know all of us who support the Netherland Inn recognize that shipping down on the Holston River was very important to Kingsport. But Kingsport would never, ever have gotten started without a railroad. Carter wanted that. Back in 1832 in South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, who was one of my mother's heroes, John C. Calhoun had wanted a railroad. And he had said, we need a railroad from South Carolina all the way to Cincinnati. George Carter felt the same way, but he knew probably couldn't get one that far. He wanted one from the mining country of Virginia and Kentucky into the Carolinas or over to the coast. Carter was busy buying up land for the railroad, and he ran out of money. Now, this is around the turn of 1900, early 1900s. He formed a consortium, the CC&O, the Carolina, the Clinchfield, the Carolina, and the Ohio consortium, to go to New York City to get money, northern money. He happened to go to a firm up there called the Blair Firm. Working in the Blair Firm was a fellow named John B. Dennis. So he gets these guys from that firm to come down here, look at the land, talk about a railroad. They backed it, and in 1915, the railroad was finished from Dant, Virginia to Spartanburg at a cost of $40 million. Now, the CC&O, the company that John B. Dennis worked for in New York City, had a big stake in this railroad. Enter John B. and J. Fred Johnson. I think we ought to go to the train station, Kenny. Let's do that. Let's show everybody. This is a great looking thing here. The architect that J. Fred and John B. hired from New York City, Thomas McKenzie, designed the train station. I love this about him. He had been an architect up there, primarily known for designing townhouses in New Jersey. But they got him down here, and he did the train station. Another shot at the train station. Yeah. Stay on top. Stay. Hey, on the right side, you see the land up here. I don't think I can get around there. Looks like a yard here close to me. During World War II, the Kingsport Garden Club had a victory garden there that for the whole town. Everybody worked that victory garden right by the train station. Now, let's see. J. Fred Johnson owned this big store. My dad came here in 25 to work for him in the big store. Now, J. Fred was from Hillsville, Virginia. Born in 1874, his dad had a store in Hillsville. But when he was a teenager, his dad died, leaving him with a mother and two sisters to support and this store. So J. Fred quit school, ran the store. He managed to finish his schooling, and he even managed to do what we call reading the law. He read the law. So he was an educated person, but he knew stores, and he knew how to run stores. So we pick him up when he marries George Carter's sister. By 1905, J. Fred is working for George Carter buying up land for this railroad. He's kind of a land agent. He also is busy trying to get a store in Kingsport. His first store was in Bristol. His second store was not at the corner of Main and Shelby. It was down closer to the river. But this was the store that was the center of commerce in Kingsport. Now, this store, it had everything. It was kind of the center of commerce. It was open from 7 in the morning till 11 at night. And 2 clerks slept in it all night in case anybody needed anything. There was a post office, there was a bank, there was a barber shop. They sold clothing, hardware, there was an undertaking establishment, and next door was a livery stable. You name it, the big store had it. Now, the main thing, I was not in the world when my dad worked there because J. Fred Johnson Company moved to Broad Street and was no longer known as the big store. But Mr. Johnson encouraged people to spin off. For example, George Taylor worked for him, and he spun off to start the hardware store, Dobbins Taylor. Hamlet Dobson was another spin-off from the big store because Mr. Johnson was very anxious to get Kingsport rolling. And if you get something rolling, you got to have more than one store. This is J. Fred's after it moved to Broad Street. And I'm sure some of you all remember that J. Fred's. The thing about that I remember the most about J. Fred's was probably the mantra of service. My dad was always on call. He didn't have a weekend off or a night off. If anybody went to the hospital and they needed pajamas, house shoes, or a coat, a house coat, they called and he was to go to the store and get it and take it to the hospital. If anybody needed something at the funeral home, they called and he was to go. The mantra was service. That was the whole thing. Now, once this center of commerce, a store, had been established, John B. Dennis became more influential. Now, in the meantime, I do need to tell you that no one really knows why, but J. Fred Johnson and George Carter had some kind of falling out. By 1915, they're no longer, George Carter's not much of a player. Kingsport is in the hands of J. Fred Johnson and John B. Dennis. Now, J. Fred wanted a town. He made no bones about it. He told his wife, he said, we can either be wealthy or we can build a town. And they agreed maybe they'd just build a town. John B. Dennis wanted to be a player. He had contacts, he had northern money, but he didn't want to give interviews, he didn't want to make speeches. John B. Dennis was almost totally deaf. So he hired J. Fred as kind of a one-man chamber of commerce, which suited J. Fred just fine. Now, they realized pretty early on that they needed to plan this town. So they set up this company called the Kingsport Development Company, which still exists, and which was to divide up parks, roads, have residential areas, etc. And they realized they needed somebody to plan this. So back to the Northeast they went. They got a fellow named John Nolan out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, you know, when people think, well, you have a city planner, that he probably came down here and stayed a lot. He didn't come down here and stay a lot. He came down here a few times, looked at the terrain, and figured out very simply how the town ought to be laid out. And what he did was to say, let's put the commercial part of it, the retail, put it in the middle, Broad Street. Put it right in the middle. Now, on one end of it, horseshoe around one end of it, all of your industry. Well, that's not hard. We used to have the press. We lost the press, but go around that horseshoe. You can see it. You got the press. You had Meade, which is now Domtar. You had Penn-Dixie. Then you came on around. You had Slipknot. You had Blue Ridge, American Saint-Gobain, on to Borden Mill, on to Eastman. Horseshoed that way. And then Nolan said, now at the other end of this Broad Street, this retail center, you're going to horseshoe your residential. And that's what he did. He put Church Circle up there, and he horseshoed all the residential. Now, there wasn't any housing in Kingsport. When my dad came here, Alec Anderson and I laugh about this. It's an awful story. My dad was just so terribly dumb. He came and he went to this boarding house, Mrs. Crumb's boarding house, and he needed a place to stay. And so she said, well, I don't have an empty bed. And Dad said, well, have you got a double bed? Oh, dumb. Oh, he was so dumb. And she said, well, yes. And he said, well, I'll take half of it. So he did. He moved in and he took half this bed. He got in bed, and late that night, this fellow walked in. It was Bob Anderson, Alex's daddy, and here's somebody in the other side of his bed. And we've laughed. My daddy always said, he said, Bob Anderson taught me how to drink and I taught him how to dance. See, I told you, Jolly, all this should not be on TV. But there was no housing here. There just wasn't any housing. So that was the first order of business. That's why they got Tom McKenzie in here. And the first thing he designed were these houses that are down, we call them the 50s still, across from Supermarket Row, the stucco and wood beams. Those houses sold for I'm not to White City yet, am I? No. Okay. Those houses sold for $2,500 each. Well, that was the first. I skipped the inn. I'll come back to the inn. Okay, just leave it on the inn. I'll come back. Well, I probably need to say why they needed the housing so badly. And that's good that we have the inn up. Teachers who came to Kingsport to work lived at the inn. There wasn't, as I said, any housing. My mother lived there with all the other teachers. The inn had 100 rooms, 50 of them had bathrooms. And of course on the end, the round thing on the end was the beautiful dining room. I have often thought, and I bet some of you all think too, that one reason we couldn't give up Dobbins Bennett, the old Dobbins Bennett, we couldn't give it up. We had to renovate it into John Sevier, was because we gave up the inn. So many people said, oh, we shouldn't have given it up. It was so beautiful. But by the mid-50s, it was in terrible, terrible condition and needed renovation really badly. 2 shots of that, Kenny? You got 2, don't you? Mackenzie did that one, too. He did that. And it was Mr. Johnson and John B. Dennis used it to wine and dine the people that they were trying to get to come in here and start businesses. They used this place heavily. I know Leroy Sprankle lived there too. Remember Leroy Sprankle with the football teams? He had championship football teams. He drove around on Sunday picking up these boys that he'd see out plowing. And he'd bring them in and they'd practice, and I know my daddy said he has no idea how old these boys are. But it didn't matter. Kingsport won championships. It's amazing what you can do when you don't worry about how old people are. Then we did the 50s, that housing, and then we're going to White City, aren't we? Is that right? White City. I'm back with you now, Kenny. White City's still up there. It's still up there. Many of us had friends who lived there. I lived in a little house right down over the hill from it. These houses were built for upper management and middle management people. Now, not just everybody could afford a White City house. They ran between $5,000 and $8,000. In the deed, it was written that they would always be painted white. I guess it still is. These houses were quite unique, and of course it's a historic district to this day. But only an architect who was young and was designing these for young people would do this. Every room in these houses is on a different level. Every room. You walk in the living room, it's one level. You go down 15 steps to the dining room kitchen. You go up 3 steps to a bathroom, 3 more to a bedroom, 4 more. No. You have to be young to live there. Now, of course, today there's nowhere to park, but it's still quite beautiful. It should be part of the historic zone. All right, once they had some housing going, once they had that going, and once they had a city planned, J. Fred Johnson and John B. Dennis knew they had to move on industry. They had to move. They had to get something in here. Now, after World War I, things didn't go well. Not in Kingsport. Not anywhere. It was sort of a downturn. We have a picture right here of the pulp mill, which was 1923, the Mead Corporation. That's Mead. 80 men and some mules, and the wood pulp plant, 1923. And aren't we fortunate? Aren't we fortunate that here we are in 2010? Yeah, I feel like it's 1920. And we've got Domtar. I mean, because somebody came in here and led that company and was very progressive. And it happened a dozen years ago. And so Mead has hung on to become Domtar. And then we've got the next thing to press. Isn't it sad to see the buildings come down? It's very sad. It's very sad. It was a magnificent company for many, many years. I do have to tell you about the workforce. Walter Smith was one of the managers at the press, and he's quoted as saying, "It was a good bunch of workers, but they were a tough crowd." He said, "We had to hire a retired undertaker to take up their guns as they walked in the door to work. They were working for 10 cents an hour." He said, "We also had to figure out where to put our spittoons, because," he said, "they were going to chew and they were going to spit." But he said, a very reliable, hard-working workforce. The press, 22. Now we go to next. We got Borden Mill. Oh my, this is a saga. The Borden brothers were from Fall River, Massachusetts. J. Fred Johnson didn't really know them. John B. Dennis did. They had textile mills in Fall River. So John B. said this would be a good move if we could get them to come in here with a textile mill. Well, naturally they were interested because they thought they were going to come down here and get some cheap labor. So they came down, they looked it over, and Kingsport Development sweetened the deal. They gave them 100 acres. So, incentives are nothing new. We all scream today, well, why are you giving this and that? Hey, you give things to get people to come. So, okay, they tell J. Fred and John B. they want to build a textile village. Like a coal mining town. So many houses around the mill. They're going to build 250. 250 houses around the mill. So, sounds good. We need housing. Sounded good until they're coming down here for dinner, and it comes to J. Fred's attention that they intend to put outhouses with those houses. It is 1924. You don't build houses with outhouses. And he would not have dinner with them. He said, this is not the kind of town we are building. They backed off. They backed down. In the face of that, they backed down. The next thing that happened, it came to their attention that they intended to advertise and to hire only women. Cheaper labor. They work cheaper in the north. And they stood them down again and said, nope, that's not what we're going to do in Kingsport, Tennessee. We're going to be equal opportunity. It'll be offered to men and to women, and the women aren't going to work any cheaper. J. Fred Johnson said later, he said, I always wondered if we made a mistake in bringing them in. I didn't know them, and it seems we had a lot of trouble. But, I think it was probably very fortunate because Eastman wasn't getting up and running. And in 1928, Borden Mill had several thousand employees. And it held Kingsport because Eastman didn't get really going till 1930. Now, in 1920, George Eastman came down here and he bought the wood alcohol plant. And, oh my goodness, they wined him, they dined him, they chased him, they did everything. They were so excited they wanted George Eastman in here. It was said that when they took him down to Rotherwood to go hunting, if George Eastman took a shot, 40 birds fell. J. Fred sent him birthday cards, he sent him greeting cards, Valentine's Day, Easter, everything. He put on parades when George Eastman came to town. Well, in 1924, things weren't looking good. They were not looking a bit good. So it was very fortunate that Borden Mill was looking good. By 1930, things had perked up a lot. The yarn plant, CE division, cellulose esters had moved down here, and Eastman was getting a foothold. Of course, we all know what the war did. The war and Eastman just intertwined. This house, Borden Mill Village, lovely, huh? This is a middle management or an upper management home in Borden Mill Village, 1939. Nice homes they eventually did put in. Okay, Kenny, what's next? Eastman, Rotherwood, that's Rotherwood where John B. Dennis lived. Now, I guess we ought to leave that. Eastman? No, what do we got now? Let's go on to Eastman, we'll come back to Rotherwood. Okay, this is about 52, isn't it? 52. Okay, 52. This is after the war. It was thanks to Eastman and the can-do people that worked there that we got Holston Ordnance Works, which was built in 42 during the war, big war effort. $80 million it took to build Holston Ordnance Works, which manufactured RDX, the explosive, the major explosive. And all of us who grew up in this town do remember, if we were of that age, we do remember all the blackouts we had. We had many, many blackout nighttime drills because, as all the kids said, we've got a bomb factory here. And we did. Rotherwood was commandeered by the military. They moved into Rotherwood and lived there for the duration of the war to run HOW. Now, Kingsport in 1920 had 6,000 people. By 1945, Kingsport had 51,000 people. That's what the war did around here. 51,000 by 1945. Everybody, of course everybody across the country was in the war effort, but in Kingsport, industrial town that it was, so many things came together. It was claimed that all of the policy manuals and the training manuals for the Army, the Navy, the Air Force came out of Kingsport, Tennessee. The paper was printed, the press did the printing, Holliston Mills and Borden Mill did the backing for those training manuals. Borden Mill won the E Award, the Army-Navy Excellence Award, for the production of cloth for uniforms. Eastman and Holston Ordnance Works won the E Award for the production of war material. I think, go to Jimmy's Candy Kitchen. Got Jimmy's? Can you all see Jimmy's Candy Kitchen next to Singer? I think Jimmy Vavalides should have won the E Award. Jimmy had this little restaurant where you got sandwiches and desserts and all this kind of stuff. And during the war, believe this if you can, for a year and a half, Jimmy Vavalides kept that little restaurant open 19 hours a day. He closed it at 2 in the morning. He opened it at 7. And the reason, he said, somebody's got to feed all these people who are doing all this work so we can win this war. I've already made the comment that up the end of the street was the Victory Garden. When the war was over, we were up on 51,000 people. In the meantime, over the years, in 41, we got a radio station. Everybody remembers Martin Courant with the Model City radio station affiliated with NBC. Mr. Johnson had gotten us a hospital. Have I run off and left you, Kenny? This is where it was. It's still the footprint for where we keep building around Wellmont. Mr. Johnson was a Democrat, but he never voted for FDR. And he didn't vote, he didn't like the New Deal, and he didn't like TVA, but he didn't have any trouble going to get money wherever he could. He got $300,000 to build that hospital. Only $100,000 of it came out of this town because he knew people just did not have the money to do it. So he got us a hospital. I guess the only thing I haven't covered now might be our educational system. We had the radio station, we had the hospital, we had downtown. In 1936, the State Theater came and the town burgeoned. This is the first school. Kenny wanted me to be sure and tell you that those towers are the First Baptist Church. The school was on the site of what is the First Presbyterian Church. And in 1919, there were 3 graduates. Just a couple or 3 years later, they built a school called the Central School, which is now those apartments, the old Washington School that are now apartments. That was the first school. And in 1926, we all know what that is. That was built in 26 for $250,000. And 2 people designed it. Finally, we had a Kingsport architect, Mr. Allen Dryden Sr. and Thomas McKenzie did the high school. That's in 26. Now, this is in, well, I think you said this was 36, didn't you? By this time, we got some paving there. One of the proudest things, I suppose, Kingsport has had, and I'm partial to this, of course, is the system of education. Mr. Johnson went over and talked to Mr. Gilbreth in Johnson City at East Tennessee State, what we know today as East Tennessee State University, and talked to him about an educational system. And eventually they decided to go to Columbia University and ask the folks up there to plan a school system, which they did, and they patterned it on a school system in Gary, Indiana. And they said you need 3 areas. You need work, study, and play. So what they meant by that was you needed courses that people could use to go to work. You needed typing, you needed accounting, you needed woodworking, you needed home ec, those work-related courses. They also said you need academics. Kingsport offered Latin from the get-go, the math, the English, the foreign language. And finally, they said you do need courses that we call play, but they're the fine arts. It's art, it's music, it's physical education, it's drama. These things add to the culture of your people. And I am so proud of one thing about our system. In all the cutbacks that systems have gone through over the years, our system has never cut out the fine arts. Never. As other school systems have. As they've said, we have to cut, we're going to go there, cut that out. As a matter of fact, about 6 or 7 years ago, a very proud moment for me, there was a $62,000 college scholarship given to an art student, which I thought spoke very well for that dedication. In conclusion, and I know you all wish I'd shut up, in conclusion, when George Eastman was getting ready to really put money and manpower and infrastructure down here, he asked J. Fred Johnson, he said, now, J. Fred, you need to tell me what kind of people are down here. Of course, he was from Rochester, New York. He said, what kind of people are they? What kind of workforce am I going to have? And J. Fred just looked at him and he said, well, George, I'm one of them. Thanks very much.